Last Saturday, when it was scorching hot outside, I went for a bicycle ride, and I bit off a little more than I can chew given the weather. I usually take money with me, and so if I need to stop water or get something to eat, I can, but I forgot my money last Saturday, and I realized that only after I had drained my water bottles about halfway through my ride. Should I stop and ask someone for water, and where should I stop? Perhaps owing to my brain not functioning particularly well, I decided that it would be a good idea to stop at a tire store, and I walked in thinking that they would have a water cooler, which they did. And I said to the man at the counter, "May I get some water from your cooler, please?" And he looked at me, he frowned, and he said, "We're all out of water." And they really were in the cooler. And that wasn't code for anything. He wasn't trying to kick me out. There was no water in the water cooler. And so I stared at that water cooler for a few seconds, so close and yet so far. Now, another male employee who was helping a customer said to her, "Excuse me, just a moment." And he saw me staring at the cooler and he said, "Buddy, I'll get you some in just a minute or two." So I went outside, and a couple of minutes later, he handed me 2 cold water bottles. And I said, "I only need one. One is great. Thank you so much." And he said, "What are you doing? It's 100 degrees outside. Take them both. What's your deal?" More than I had asked for, surprising in its simplicity, beautiful in its excess. Water for thirst, coolness in the heat, getting bailed out of a situation that I had been dumb enough to put myself in. And so I went home. And really, who among us would not give water to the person that asked? Luke 11 is ostensibly about prayer. And it feels to me like I've had experiences similar to the one at the tire shop when praying. For everyone who asks receives, and who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will open. And it does feel like I have knocked on the door fairly persistently at times, and the answer has been fresh out of water. And also, here's twice what you asked for, and it's cold to boot. More than you had imagined, better than you could have dreamt. This whole passage is a strange collection. "Lord," the disciples say, "teach us how to pray." Why did they need to be taught how to pray? Was it the form or the content that required some education? And so Jesus gives us some content by introducing the Lord's Prayer, or some of it anyway, and then he discusses the form that prayer might take by describing the absurd situation of a man at midnight seeking bread for a friend. Is the friend who is already in bed and being bothered meant to represent God? And if so, I have some questions now. Is Jesus saying then that if you bother God in the middle of the night, God will initially say, "No, I'm not coming," but if you keep knocking and persisting, God will grumble and moan and complain about the fact that God was already asleep, but eventually, if you're going to nag God well enough and long enough, God will shuffle out of bed, bleary-eyed, a bit annoyed, open the door a crack, and give you some bread anyway? Is that what Jesus is saying? I tell you, even though he will not get up and give him anything because he is his friend, at least because of his persistence, he will get up and give him whatever he needs. A reminder perhaps to take Jesus seriously, but perhaps not literally. And those people, those poor disciples who asked him in the first place, seeking a bit of advice, he then turns to them at the end and says, "If you all who are evil will not give a scorpion to a child who asks for an egg, then how much more will God give to you?" We just asked for a bit of advice, and now we're all evil? Jesus once again proves to us that he would make an atrocious motivational poster creator. Humanity, you're evil, but lucky for you, God is not. Yay! So let's just go back to the beginning real quick again. Teach us how to pray, and Jesus says, have reverence for God and for the name of God, for it is hallowed. And give us each our daily bread. Give us each our daily bread. Give us all our daily bread. It's for everyone. It's not just for me. So God's name is to be hallowed. Request for daily bread is for everyone. Forgiveness then follows, including forgiveness of others. And lastly, a desire to not face ultimate consequences. So there's a flow. God is to be revered. We seek sustenance for all people, forgiveness of self and others, and then a desire to not suffer at the hands of evil for living in this simple way. And then the examples come of the friend in the night and bread for someone passing through, and the guy grumbles but gets up anyway. And all because it isn't just a matter of being annoying. The person knocking on the door isn't doing it for sport, but to feed someone their daily bread, even though it's the middle of the night. In other words, it may feel like it can be hard to rouse God sometimes, but if we are pursuing hospitality, bread for the hungry, daily bread for ourselves and for another, God will see to that. And if you asked for an egg, God would see to that. And if a child asked for a fish, you would give that. You would make absolutely sure that the child would receive a fish. How much more is God interested in these things, Jesus says. Prayer and daily bread, prayer and reverence for God, prayer and hospitality, prayer and basic essential needs, they all go hand in hand. If you persist in seeking daily bread, especially for another, the door will be opened. Prayer is not so much an open-ended conversation telling God all about your life, Jesus says, as it is an urging toward God for daily bread, for sustenance and for hospitality for all to be fulfilled. And really, who among us would not give water to the person that asked? There are many upsetting, unsettling things. There are many racist, ugly things that have been said in the public square this week. And you all can take your pick as to which one you find most outrageous. For me, a reference to migrants and the policy of demanding that if asylees enter Guatemala, they must apply for asylum in Guatemala, even though that is totally unworkable at the moment. In the midst of that, in referring to asylum applicants from Honduras and El Salvador, there was a little line that was easy to miss or dismiss, but was so shocking and outrageous. These are bad people, the president said of migrants from Central America. These are bad people. Now, many of you who have known me for the last 4 years or longer know that I don't get too amped up over the good old days. But there are times from our past when we did better, and we needed to be reminded of those from time to time. I'm arguing that daily bread and hospitality, prayer and reverence all go hand in hand, and that hospitality is a wonderful expression of faith. Last Sunday afternoon, the day after getting the couple of cold waters of water at the tire shop, I was at the library in the children's section waiting for my 2 children to finish finding some books. And on the display, there was a book called 30 Minutes Over Oregon by Mark Tyler Nobleman, a children's book. I flipped through it. 10 minutes later, a young girl walked past me while I was reading it, and she stared at me as she was walking past, wondering why tears were rolling down my cheeks. Nobuo Fujita flew 2 missions over the United States in 1942. He dropped bombs on our country, hoping to start massive forest fires in southwest Oregon. Neither attempt worked particularly well. Fires never really got going. The forest was too wet. Fujita was ultimately recruited in 1945 to become a kamikaze pilot, but was stopped from his mission by the ending of the war. He opened a hardware store in Tokyo, and that was that. He never told his family about what he had done during the war, and he was content to take his memories to the grave someday. But in 1962, in Brookings, Oregon, the JCs there wanted to do something to boost tourism for their little town. Brookings was the town closest to where Nobuo Fujita had dropped his bombs, and so as a part of their Memorial Day festivities, they invited Fujita as a guest of honor. This was controversial, to say the least. 17 years after the wars, hardly any time at all in the scheme of these sorts of things. Fujita had to tell his family about why a small town in Oregon had invited him to come. They had no idea what he had done in the war. He ultimately came, but he wondered when he came, during his journey across the Pacific Ocean, if it was all a setup. He wondered if, upon landing, they would pounce on him and try to prosecute him. So to his amazement, he was greeted warmly and enthusiastically. Nevertheless, he brought with him his samurai sword. He would, he decided, seek forgiveness and reconciliation with the people of Brookings by gifting them his sword, his family sword that had been in his family for 400 years, as a symbol of that forgiveness. But if they did not accept his attempts at forgiveness, he would commit seppuku, suicide by one overcome with shame. Nobuo Fujita was welcomed by the people of Brookings, and sword was installed at the public library in town. He met children, and he met one of the men who had put out a small fire that had started in the spot where Fujita had dropped his bomb. The man said to Nobuo Fujita, "You are one of the worst fire setters ever to have lived." Fujita was not a wealthy man, but he plowed his savings into one day hosting 3 high school students from Brookings, and he gave them a tour in Japan. In 1992, he was invited back to Oregon and planted a redwood sapling on the site where he dropped his first bomb 50 years earlier. He donated some money to the library in Brookings for books to be purchased, dedicated to teaching children about other cultures. He wondered if World War II might have been different if his own people had learned more about other cultures. In 1997, Nobuo Fujita fell ill and was hospitalized. A town representative from Brookings flew to Tokyo and at his bedside told Nobuo Fujita that he had become an honorary citizen of the town of Brookings, Oregon. At peace, he passed away the very next day. And really, who among us would not give water to the person that asked? It would be easy, but far too simplistic, to draw a line from the story of Nobuo Fujita and say, if we could only go back to better times, but that isn't really the point. 1962, when Nobuo Fujita came to Brookings with his sword, America had all sorts of problems, and it still does. More to the point, a community got together and sought to extend hospitality. Aware of the bigger story, the national or international narrative, they also sought out one act, one person, one thing, one moment of forgiveness, one chance for reconciliation. Lost amidst the large narrative was a smaller one, but an important one. That is, that Americans sought to love the other. This week I've been writing public comments on regulations.gov and the Department of Homeland Security in protest of the expansion of authority to ICE agents to execute expedited deportations. I'm protesting the agreement with Guatemala and writing letters to editors and checking in on Team Brownsville at the border. We are organizing collections and support for refugees and asylees close to home and at the border. But it can be very time-consuming and energy-sapping. And one small act doesn't ever feel like enough against the wave of rules and laws and vitriol. In the face of stigmatization and moving targets, one court in the District of Columbia issuing one ruling and one in California issuing a contradictory ruling, how can one ever stay on point? And you've got jobs and children and homes to tend to. How can we ever keep up? That's why prayer and prayer for daily bread is so important. A grounding in both matters and jobs and children and homes, because all of those things matter. Grant us, not me, not my family, grant us, grant all of us our daily bread. Simple and yet beautiful. Surprising in its capacity to generate excess and grace. What can get lost in the bitterness and the arguments about policies is that we in the church are called to be little Christs. When we are Christians, little Christ, people interested in daily bread, everyone's daily bread. And you might be called to be a little Christ, but not the Christ. It isn't your job or my job to save the world. It is your job to be your brother or your sister's keeper, to have pity and compassion for the other, to extend bread, to reach out to people on the run, to be good people, to be good Christian people, to be good Christian American people, to be good Christian American citizens of the world. And really, who among us would not give water to the one who asked? Peace be with you.